Hello and welcome back to the Little Craft House's YouTube channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Nicole and I love to make polymer clay earrings. I also love making tutorials showing you guys how fun and easy it is to create them. Today's tutorial is part of my colour mixing series. This is where I take packet colours that I already own and mix them up to make some new custom colours. I find colour mixing is a great way to get those creative juices flowing, and new colours always get me inspired for some new creations. I've created a few colour mixing tutorials in the past and you guys always have some great questions for me. So today I thought I would run this colour mixing tutorial slightly different, and whilst I'm mixing up the colours, I thought that I would answer some of the most common questions that are asked to me. So instead of talking you guys through the process as I'm doing it, I'm going to answer some of the questions, but you can still watch me creating the colours, and at the end of each new colour I will be recording and writing down that colour mix recipe so that if you guys would like to recreate them at home you can as well. So the first thing that I'm going to start with is conditioning, and that is what I'm doing here with these clays. So we need to condition our clays to get them soft and workable. So some clays are softer than others, so they don't require quite as much work. If your clay is particularly firm, it's always a good idea to slice it into smaller size pieces to start with, and then use your acrylic roller, like I'm doing here, to soften it before putting it through a pasta machine if you have one. So adding some warmth can also help you with softening your clays. You'll notice that in summer your clay will be much softer to use than in the colder months when it'll be a lot firmer. So if you're working in a particularly cold area or with those firmer clays, I find that warming it up slightly can help. So how do you do that, you ask? Well, good question. So if you've got warm hands, just squeezing and rolling the clay within your hands will be a really good start. And it might sound a little bit silly, but I also like to sit on my clay. Now, obviously I will wrap it up in a bit of plastic first to avoid any dust and lint and fabric affecting the clay. But yeah, just having a bit of that warmth, body warmth put into it will help to warm and soften the clay. I also have a little wheat pack that I have in my craft room because my craft room gets really cold in winter. So that's the type that you will warm up in the microwave. So when that wheat pack's nice and warm, not hot, but just a warm, I'll sit that on my lap and I will just put the clay there as well, and that will add a little bit of warmth to that. Now, I must give a big warning though, is that if you add too much warmth, you're going to start baking your clay, and that's just going to make a whole set of new problems. So you just need to work out what that sweet spot is, enough warmth to soften without cooking it. Also important to note is to never use your microwave. If you put your clay in the microwave, it will just melt it and burn. So you'll see here that I am just using my pasta machine to condition the clay. So I'll come back and talk about pasta machines in just a moment, but still just continuing on with the conditioning, I just wanted to talk about if your clay is too soft and sticky and it's over conditioned. When we're working with mixing new colours with our colour recipes, we are working the clay a lot. So sometimes your clay can become over conditioned and becomes sticky and too soft to work with and just becomes a bit of a mess. So what I like to do to firm it back up is exactly the opposite of what we do with that firm clay. So now we need to cool our clay down. So this will also apply if you're working during those warmer, hotter summer months as well. So the best way to firm our clays back up again is just to leave them for either a couple of hours or overnight and just let the clay settle back down. You'll find that will just firm back up naturally overnight and you'll be good to go the next day. However, if you do want to do it a little bit quicker, you can pop your clays into the fridge and that will definitely cool them down and just help to firm them back up. Another thing that you can do to help firm those clays is just to roll it out to probably the thicknesses that I'm showing on screen here, and then I would just put it onto a piece of your normal white printer photocopy paper, and that will help to draw out some of the excess oils that may be within that clay as well, and that will also help to firm it up. You don't want to leave that for too long though, because you don't want to obviously draw out too much, but that's another way that you can help to firm your clay back up. So I just quickly mentioned before about the pasta machine, and a question I get asked quite often about colour mixing is, do you need a pasta machine or a clay conditioning machine to mix colours? And the answer is absolutely not. Obviously, if you have one of those machines, it can make the process a lot quicker and easier, and it's less strenuous on your hands, but you definitely don't have to have one. There are a couple of different ways that you can mix your colours, one being with the pasta machine, one being just with your hands, and one being with the acrylic roller. So in today's demonstration, I will show all three ways of doing it, and you guys can just pick which method that you like to work with best for when you're colour mixing. So next up, we're going to talk about portions. So this is probably the main reason why I like to use my pasta machine for colour mixing. So it's important that when we are doing our recipes for these new colours that we're using equal portions. So that way, each time we replicate our colours, they will always end up the same. So I've put each of my colours through the pasta machine on the thickest setting, and then that way they are all the same level thickness. If you're working without a pasta machine, you can use something to make a thickness guide. So whether that be pop sticks or rulers or something that's going to make all of your clay the same level thickness. And then when it comes to cutting out each of these portions, I'm using one of my shape cutters, and I like to use symmetrical shapes. So either squares or circles or something that's symmetrical, because when our recipes call for halves or quarters or eighths of a piece, it's much easier if your shape is of a symmetrical shape. Now, I know that some people who create recipes will do it by weight, but for me personally, I just prefer this technique. So yeah, just using all of our clays at the same level and then using the same shape cutter to cut each of these portions. Now, I do like to start by cutting them all as a whole portion first. So if this was a recipe, these would be what is equal to 1. So 1 portion would be 1 piece. When I'm mixing colours, whether it be as I'm coming up with these colour mixes or when I'm doing the demonstrations for you guys, I like to just go through and cut out all of my portions first, and then that way they're just all to the side and ready to go, and it actually makes the colour mixing process a lot quicker then. And because we rolled our clays all to that same thickness, it means that I can scrunch up any of the scraps, whack them back through the pasta machine, and then I can cut some more pieces as well. I realised whilst I was doing this one here that I by far did not roll out enough of the yellow, because we do use quite a few yellows in today's recipes. So another thing that I quite often get asked about when I'm demonstrating these colour mixing recipes for you guys is I get asked about the quantities that I'm making. So I only make small quantities when I'm demonstrating these colour recipe tutorials. One of the reasons that I do this is I like to just show you guys the base recipe that I use. So if the recipe calls for 1-to-1 ratio of a colour, I will demonstrate it as 1-to-1. That doesn't mean that you can't make more of this. If a recipe is 1-to-1, you can always change it up to being 2-to-2, 3-to-3, 4-to-4, etc. to make more of that recipe or more of that colour. You can also use thicker clay or larger cutters if you want to make your portions larger. You don't have to just stick with those smaller amounts. So quite often when I do my projects using these colours, I'll go back in and mix up some more afterwards. As long as you always stick to the same ratio, your colours will always come out being the same. I mentioned briefly before about people using weights for doing their portioning. So if you didn't want to use my portion style of making these recipes, there are a few other alternative ways that you can do it. So weights being one of them. So what you would need to do if you wanted to just use weights was set a weight as 1 portion. So maybe you would choose something like 10 grams being your singular portion, and then you could adjust it accordingly. So for example, 5 grams would then be a half portion. Also, another way you could do it is many of the clay blocks, for example Sculpey and Fimo, all come with preset portion guides on them. So you'll notice that those blocks are divided into 4 or 5 sections. So this could also be an option. So cutting your block up into these, using these predetermined lines, one of those sections would be one portion, and then you can again adjust from there. So these are just alternative options, obviously. You don't have to follow those. I like doing my cutter way, but being crafters and being creative, we don't have to follow set rules as such. So just find a way that's going to work for you when portioning out your clay and go from there with it. Another question that I get asked a lot about is substituting colours within these recipes. Now, of course, you can definitely do this. However, the final colour may differ slightly from the colour that I'm showing you. So an example of this is way back in one of my first colour recipes, I made a recipe for a colour that needed orange, and it needed pumpkin orange. But when I went to go and remake this colour, I didn't have any pumpkin on hand, so I used koi instead. Now, koi is a bit of a brighter orange colour than the pumpkin, but they still looked very close, and I didn't think that the end colour would be too different. But in saying that, once I started working with it, I realised that the makeup of koi had a lot more yellow in it. So the base colour was mainly yellow. So when I did the final colour, this had definitely affected it and made it more yellowy than what I wanted. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes when this happens, the substituted colour can make a nicer colour mix than the original colour, and I've had that happen as well. So when it works out differently, I'll make sure that I cut a small little sample piece and then I will write my recipe down, because then that way I can replicate that colour again if I need to, or if in the future I go to reproduce the colour and realize again that I don't have that colour, I'll know how it's going to turn out by using that substituted one. I also wanted to talk about mixing brands within recipes and just in general really. So usually my recipes I'll keep within the same family. So I'll use Primo and Souffle, which both come from the Sculpey family, or I'll use Fimo and Fimo Professional, which is obviously from the Fimo family, but you can definitely create colours that mix between these brands. So anything from like your Fimo, your Sculpey, your Cernet, any of those clay families, you can mix between all of them together. So they're all compatible and they'll all work together nicely. Now, in saying that, one thing to be aware of when mixing between different clay families is their bake time and bake temperature. So not so much the time, but more the temperature. So when you're using Fimo or Fimo Professional, they bake at a lower temperature than the Cernet and Sculpey brands of clay. So you just need to keep that in mind when baking these colours, because you may notice that lighter colours can tend to essentially burn a little bit and go darker. But depending on how much of those colours you're using, it may not actually affect your clay at all. Otherwise, you can adjust your temperature by turning it down just slightly so that way your clays don't overcook. And this goes the same for if you're using the different brands within the same project. Sometimes it's more noticeable if those colours are lighter. If they're darker, they don't tend to change much at all in the baking process. So next up, I wanted to talk about the recording of these colour recipes. So as I'm making the colour recipes and the colour turns out the way I like it, I like to record it down onto some little cards so that I've got that recipe for future. And I also do it so that you guys can see what those colour recipes are as well. So the little cards that I use, I just designed up on my computer and got them printed through one of the business card printing companies. I am working on a slightly different version, which I think will be a little bit more useful. So once I've finished getting that one organised, I will share that template with you all so that you can use that same one. So that's looking like it'll be ready for me to share with you all, hopefully early in the new year. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for that, and I will let you all know once that's all nice and ready to go. Now don't stress if you don't have a specific card to record your recipes on. You can use the backs of old business cards or a notebook or anything like that. Maybe a little photo album where you can slide your bits in to keep them organised. You could even write on the back of the sample, but just as long as you keep it recorded down so that you know for future how to reproduce those colours. And so the key things to remember to record down when writing down your recipes, whether they're ones you're making yourself or ones that you are replicating of mine, is to make sure that you write down how many portions are required and of which colour. So when recording the colours down, I like to write down the colour name, and I'll also write next to it a symbol for the brand. So whether it be S for souffle, P for primo, or F for Fimo. If I'm using Fimo Professional, I'll do FP, and if I'm using Cernet, I'll use the letter C. I also like to write down if there's anything specific that I need to remember for next time as well. So usually I don't do that on these cards. It's usually during my process of making new colours. If a colour has been substituted for another colour, I might write that it's the alternative to the other recipe. I'll also sometimes name the colours if I'm feeling all fancy and willing, but a lot of the time I don't actually give the colours a name because I don't really think that it's overly necessary. But one thing that I will always do is cut a small little sample. So you'll always see me in these recipes cutting a little sample out, and I'll push that down on the top of the colour card. So I do that so that I have a sample of what that colour looks like. And once I've finished all the colours in that colour palette, I'll go through and bake up each of those little samples. And that also helps for in future seeing the finished colour. So sometimes our colours do change slightly when they're baked, especially if you're using translucent based colours. They sometimes will look quite different once they are baked. So by having a baked sample on the top of our colour card, it serves a couple of purposes. Firstly, you can see what that colour will look like once baked up as opposed to when it is raw. You'll also be able to use that colour if you're designing a project and you're looking for a specific colour palette. You're able to put these little colour samples next to each other, and from there you can decide which colours match nicely and which ones you would like to use together in your project. So once I have my little recipe cards all written up and I have my sample piece baked up, I'll glue that little sample piece onto the card, and then I will store them away in my little box. I've got a little divided up box. Each section will have each colour tone. So there's a section for the reds, a section for the blues, a section for the greens, and then that way it's quite easy just to flick through and pick out the colours that I'm wanting to use. So the last thing that I get asked quite often is, why do I colour mix? Why do I bother making new colours when there are so many colours available through all the different brands straight out the packet? Well, there are a few reasons, and I briefly touched on this right at the beginning of the tutorial, but there's definitely a few reasons that I enjoy colour mixing. So the first is that I do find it really inspiring, and usually I'm either lacking in inspiration or I have too much inspiration and I can't settle on a project. So I find that by mixing some colours can help with this. It's quite therapeutic watching the colours transform as you're mixing them together, and once that new colour is born, it can usually get my creative juices flowing and I start thinking of projects that I can use that colour in, or other colours that would go with it nicely, and then I start thinking of patterns and all that kind of stuff, and then it really just gets me settled and working into that new project. So another reason that I like to colour mix is that I find that it helps to cut down on wastage. So it's a great way for me to use up colours that I wouldn't normally use, that I've packets that I've opened and I've just got sitting around, but that colour just doesn't gel with me. By transforming it into something different and new, it makes it nice and exciting for me, and therefore I'm more likely to use those colours. And then the last reason that I like to also custom colour mix is that I find that when I'm selling my earrings and handmade items at the markets, I find that it's a great little selling point and talking point with the customers. It makes them feel like their product that they're buying is, well, because it is truly unique. Another seller's not going to have exactly the same because the colours that are used in that product I've mixed myself. So it really adds to that whole handmade element because, yeah, not only is the product themselves designed and made by me, but I've also mixed up those colours as well. So it's just another great little talking point, something different and something that the customers really do seem to appreciate as well. So that brings me to the end of today's little frequently asked questions on colour mixing, as well as my little colour mixing recipes that have been going on in the background here. I'm just mixing up the final one now, and then that will bring me to the end of this tutorial. So I'd like to say once again, as always, thank you so much for watching and listening to me today. If you would like to keep up to date with all of my things going on, all of my new tutorials and everything, don't forget to follow me over on Facebook and Instagram. I pop up little mini tutorials over there throughout the week, as well as my full tutorials here every Thursday on YouTube. And if you've got any requests for any specific tutorials or any specific colour mixing recipes, please let me know because I would love to help you out and create some tutorials for you as well. So yeah, thank you once again for joining me today. I really do appreciate it, and I will be back next week with another full tutorial. I've got a great little project in mind for next week, so I hope to see you then. So have a great week everyone, and I'll see you next week. Bye!